My guest today is Robert Rinder. Robert has had a double career, first as a successful criminal barrister and then as a broadcaster on television and radio. He is best known nationwide for his ITV reality television show Judge Rinder, where he conducts small claims hearings before a live audience. He has appeared on numerous television programs, including Strictly Come Dancing and Celebrity Gogglebox, and has also hosted Good Morning Britain and his own show on TALKradio. Robert is also known for his work promoting Holocaust education, for which he was recently awarded an MBE alongside his mother, Angela Cohen. Robert, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
It is a real pleasure. It's what a lovely thing. Sometimes you're invited to do podcasts, which are, sort of so silly. It's sort of me and my cat, and I say no to all of them. So it's a above average delight to talk about something of real substance.
That is, thank you so much, and that's probably the.
Especially as I don't have a cat.
Why did they ask you? Why even ask?
You get asked all of these sort of extraordinary things. I mean, extraordinary is the wrong word. There's probably a better Yiddish word. It's sort of become mishegus things that are on podcasts nowadays.
Yeah.
That do really well, Me and my tortoise.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Does Robert have a tortoise? No, we don't care. No, anyway, so it's a delight.
Thank you so much. Delight to have you. Let's start with your MBE. Now, alongside your mum, you received this honor in recognition of your services to Holocaust education. And both of you have made tremendous contributions in not only raising awareness of the Holocaust, but towards aiding Holocaust survivors. How did you begin your work in Holocaust education, and what is it in particular that motivates you?
Mm-hmm. So, I want to be clear. I think my mum has done a lot more in terms of Holocaust education than I have, and I don't think that's kind of false modesty. I think those are the facts. So, my mum is the chair of the 45 Aid Society, which some people, I hope, will, if they don't know about, go and look up after we've had our chat. In a nutshell, those who haven't seen the documentary that I made with BBC, which was kind of born out of the Who Do You Think You Are that I was gifted and privileged to do. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, and I knew him. My grandparents were, until last year, sadly, all alive, and I knew him till I was sort of 23, and he was the kind of emotional and cultural and religious epicenter of our family. And I always knew from as young as I was able to remember that he was a survivor. Consequently, there were, I'm going to sort of loosely describe as, you might think of sort of dark whispers around him. So nobody ever talked directly about what he had experienced, but nevertheless, there was always loudly in the family that sense of what he'd been through. And that was a sort of complex thing. And after he died, I was, as I say, I knew bits of his story because we would sit around and he would tell us from time to time little pieces of the puzzle, things would emerge. And lots of second and third generation survivors of the Holocaust will tell you that that's how it emerges. It rarely sits down in one and emerges in one coherent narrative, right? For self-evident reasons. Many survivors didn't talk till much later in life. But he would sort of tell me things, and I was aware from time to time of various stories that would emerge. I went with him in 2000. I've told this story many times. When I was about 19, to the town where he was from, Pietrzków-Czerbanelski, and was aware of his. I suppose it was at the moment when where he had come from was just at the beginnings of decay, but was still there. And again, when you're young, your grandfather just is, just like you don't hear the accents of your parents if they're not born in England. So this story was always kind of the heart of who he was, but nevertheless, it wasn't, something which I was especially engaged with, but grew up with a very strong Jewish identity. And at the forefront of that, what powered that was my grandfather's experience. Went back with him to Poland, and There were a variety of extraordinary moments in that trip. One of them, perhaps not least, was um, being in the place where he had lived. And for many people, one of the things about the Holocaust, there's no quick answer to your question, I'm afraid, Ellie, right? One of the things about the Holocaust is that um, it's often presented through the kind of prism of black and white. In other words, through known historical tropes, be it through Auschwitz or the work, Schindler's List, and so on and so forth. And what's very difficult is that that puts it at through a slightly alienated historical prism, through black and white, as if it's something in the past, or as if it were an explosion of violence between one unassimilated community against another, or as if this emerged in some historical backwater. And I'd always imagined my grandfather, because that's what I've been told, as sort of growing up in what I'm loosely going to describe as the shtetl. But being in Piotrków-Trybunalski, this medieval town, seeing where he'd grown up, albeit in relative poverty, one of the things that was really extraordinary was this moment where I was able to see the wallpaper in the room where he'd grown up around a quadrangle in a flat, and the wood was precisely the same. And I'd known loosely of the names of his sisters and his parents, but no more. And we came down the stairs, and there was a woman who came out of her flat at the bottom, and she looked at him and he touched her. And it's really hard to describe that in a way that is anything more than prosaic, but it was profoundly poetic. It's kind of, if you like, where faith is. He looked at her and she sort of touched him. They said nothing and walked on. And it turned out that she was the child of the only non-Jewish family in that community of apartments, where there was real poverty, to be sure, but nevertheless they'd known each other in childhood, and she'd had no idea that he had survived. And her family were what we would know as, well, rather pejoratively perhaps, as the Shabbos goys. They would light the fires for all of the Jews on the Sabbath. And everything and nothing was said in those seconds of that meeting. She was unaware he had lived, and he was standing there with his two grandsons and his daughter. It was a really profound moment. We didn't really speak about that more. And then he died, and I got to do my Who Do You Think You Are, and then went back there. And it was the extraordinary moment because I was there on his 95th birthday, sitting in the same place, now in total decay, but then learnt a great deal more about his life. And, you know, cutting all of the detail, because I do think people should watch the program. One of the really good news stories about my Who Do You Think You Are program is that I'm looking at the front cover of who else was on it, you know, Lee Mack, Olivia Colman, and Boy George. There's a front cover to the right of me as I'm sitting here. So people certainly, you know, more well known in the public eye than me. But actually what was fascinating is that my episode almost doubled the audience of anybody else in that series. And it certainly wasn't because of me, it was because of the subject matter. And on top of that, because BBC really do explore these things and do pretty good analysis, and also because I was following it too, there wasn't a peep of anti-Semitism on social media, but a real open-minded curiosity to understand and know more. And so from there, I, alongside the filmmakers and the production house, asked whether we could make another film called The Holocaust, My Family and Me. And really, one of the things that mattered in that series was how we were going to kind of frame that program. And I sort of come back to the beginning of that story in terms of my relationship with Holocaust education, which is a concern that I have that it retains an enduring relevance. And that relevance has to be set and rooted in something that matters universally. And again, I come back to that problem as very often when I meet, as I do nowadays, I'll come onto my mum's role in all this in a second, people will say, I watch your program about the Holocaust, I've been to Auschwitz, or they'll say sort of things of that kind, which is good. It's important to go there. And yes, Auschwitz represents a critical element of the Shoah, not least the fact that it's the apotheosis of modernity, right? In other words, it's a factory of death. It's what happens when the first inverted commas civilized world descends into depravity. But what you'll notice, I hope, when people see the Holocaust, My Family and Me, is at the center of it is that every story we follow has three elements. The first, and perhaps foremost, leaving my own story out of it, is that they all begin in Western Europe. And that really matters. It's impossible to overstate the significance of that. In other words, the reminder of universality, the idea that that this took place not in some backwater, but at the cradle of the most advanced liberal democracy on the planet at the time, pretty much. And so, and all of those countries represented that, and all of the architecture and the culture, and all of the things that, even as we sit here today, that feel. I was in Ukraine recently, and there's a resonance there. All of the things that you think of what I might loosely describe as first world, therefore somehow cushion you against the notion that the state or the government or our communities are going to descend into depravity because you're present against a backdrop of things that feel modern, right? I wanted to make sure that the stories were rooted there, in other words, in Germany, Holland, and France, and especially in Germany and Holland. So the architecture and the things, and as I say, all of the things that make us feel protected in some way. In other words, it was a call against complacency. The stories began of lives of people who were living in assimilated conditions not dissimilar from our own as Jews. That was the first thing. Secondly, an element of heroism, because I think people need to be told they're heroic in order to meet that label. As Maya Angelou said, you can't practice any of the virtues consistently without courage. I think if we tell people they're courageous, they'll act accordingly, and they want to believe that they're on the right side of history. Most people, and lastly, there was. This other element of talking about the universality of trauma. So in the aftermath of the Holocaust, My Family and Me, there were discussions about how we talk about our parents and our grandparents' experiences in general, both through the Shoah, both through the Holocaust, but also during the war, and how we come to understand this generation who were forged in trauma. And that applies to all sorts of different groups. And consequently, from there, how we use the lessons of the Holocaust as a way of countering anti-Jewish racism, firstly because you become a personal witness to the stories you saw, and how then we can talk about the Shoah and other genocides in general without equivocating them, just thinking about it as a volcano in a dark landscape, as a means of talking about becoming empowered to talk about to become activist in anti-prejudice movements. That's a really long way of describing how I became, but I'm sorry, there's no shorthand. My grandfather's story at the epicenter of it, and actually the most moving part, surprisingly, is that he came to Windermere as part of the Windermere Boys. There's a film that's been made about them. Again, I'm sure I'm just saying things that a lot of people will know already who are listening to this. So 1,000 Jewish children effectively were given temporary, and emphasize that, visas to come to the UK before going on to what was then mandated Palestine or wherever else they were going. And they arrived in Windermere and a few other places, I should add, but Windermere critically. And my grandfather was at that point sort of gifted Britain, and I use that word on purpose, imbued with a love of all of the kind of British values. He was healed there, so to speak, or certainly the beginning of his healing. And because so many of the boys, although there were girls amongst them too, there's a great book about them, were orphaned and didn't have families, they formed a family of their own. And that created a big kind of international mishpoch family, where they created this organization which went on to do tzedakah, so to do charity, but also to support one another in all of the various simchas, the celebrations in life. Bearing in mind so many of their families were lost, it was effectively this massive support network. And then it went on to do something, although it took some time, for obvious reasons, because many of them couldn't or didn't have the capacity, and for a variety of reasons relating to their trauma or their sense of anxiety about being able effectively to communicate. Many of those survivors went on and have gone on, Harry Spira and many others, so Ben Helfgott perhaps at the center of it, to be a resource for Holocaust education and to go into schools and to talk to young people. And so my mum has taken over the presidency of that charity. And so really it's her work which has sort of taken it into a new territory, and it really expanded its presence that was being recognized at the palace. All I did was kind of provide the platform, I think, or as I like to say, I did the hair and makeup.
Well, it's clear that your passion for Holocaust education is something that's very connected with your mum. She's also in the documentary with you, and I want to know, what was the emotional toll that it had on you and your mum doing this together, and not only doing this together, but having it broadcast, because this is quite a personal journey that you both went on. And I'm wondering if the fact that it was going to be for television impacted you in any way.
That's a really interesting question. Ellie, it's a really interesting thing. There is a difference between second and third generation. I use the word second and third generation survivors, but those who have within our immediate family the legacy of the Holocaust, the Shoah. And as you'll see in the program, it was my mum and other second generation. Just like there's a difference often between grandchildren and their ability to speak to grandparents vis-a-vis children and parents, that's often a really complicated dynamic in families. A grandchild may have a great relationship with a grandparent and be able to communicate and draw out stories in a way that a child never can. And there are all sorts of both obvious and more nuanced reasons why that's the case. In my mum's situation, you really have to ask her, and she'd be a great person for you to speak to in this podcast. It was a different thing for both of us, I think. As any viewers will see, and I hope you do watch it, neither of us knew until the last minute that we were meeting the last living eyewitness to what had happened at Treblinka, the last human survivor. And we had no idea. Now, two things are happening. Firstly, in addition to kind of being the grandson of a survivor and standing on that earth where my great aunts and uncles' remains are, and the human remains of so many thousands of people, of course it is emotionally affecting. But at the same time, I'm also trying to be objective, because it matters to me. That's what you might describe as the kind of micro thing going on. But the big thing is I'm also aware that I'm making a television program alongside producers, which I really want as many people as possible to see. So I'm aware of that at the same time. In other words, I have a greater capacity for objectivity because it's a generation removed. For my mum, the courage required to go and stand on that earth is different. This is her dad. These are her aunts and uncles. She's lived with the immediate first-hand impact of growing up in the presence, in the fallout, in all of the toxic complexities of her father and these children that had been murdered, that were no longer there, living within the shadow, the asphyxiating shadow of death, of anti-Semitism, of existential threat her whole life, knowing this word was Treblinka, and that's where they met their end. So for her to have walked and stood on that earth and then to have met Leon Ritz, the last survivor, took infinitely greater courage just because of the power of the impact in her life than it did for me. So the moment where we see Leon in the documentary and I say, what happened here? And he sobbed on my shoulder. And at that moment, my mum, who's a profoundly strong person, it was impossible for her to articulate how she felt or to ask questions. You know, this is the thing, this idea that this is a detail of history is an increasingly problematic phenomenon, which is a very long-winded way of saying, I'm standing there on the earth. This is my mum's aunts and uncles. This is a man who saw what took place there. And we'd gone with a very, I think, specific purpose in the filmmaking, not just to be on the earth of Treblinka, which of course, so dissimilar from Auschwitz, has nothing really there but stone memorials and the jagged suggestions of what's under the earth. It's a park, like so many of the pieces of earth where the Shoah took place, on a sunny day with a rainbow, in fact, actually, which is so difficult to manage. The strange emotional and cognitive dissonance of being in a park where this happened. But we went to make Kaddish and the Jewish memorial prayer. And again, you know, this is the thing. I'm there aware I'm making television as well as having this deeply emotional experience. But my mum took out her siddur, which had been my grandfather's. And Leon was what we might describe as firm or more orthodox. So just as a matter of derech eretz's courtesy, my mum gave him the siddur to make the Kaddish. And he said, no, you say it. And she began to say it. And of course, I wanted to say the names of our family because we had come to that place to honor, to make Kaddish for our family. And as I was about to say their names, all I can tell you is that I can't remember him touching me. I've looked at what's called the rushes. In other words, the cuts that we didn't use for the film, but the bits of film from that day. And I felt like someone touched me on my shoulder. And I don't think he did, but I do remember him. And we have it on camera. He said, no, this is for all of Kol Yisrael. It's for all of the Jewish people of the earth. And that was unbelievably moving. I think it took much more courage, and it's worth repetition, for my mum to go there. I do know that when we were on the plane home, we simply couldn't talk to one another. And I don't think we've actually spoken about that experience since, save for when she's been asked questions about it here.
Yeah.
I mean, by here, I mean in the media.
Yeah. In the Holocaust survivor Lily Ebert's book, she explains how she never really, at first, she never wanted to explain what she went through to her children in order to protect them from the horrors. By not explaining it to them, she felt that they would be protected and they wouldn't have to understand just the horrors of humanity. And I'm wondering, was this something, was your grandfather's experience something that he and your mum was always thought that it was important you should know, or did they too try and maybe safeguard you a bit?
No, I think a lot of it's much more nuanced than that, right? I think in every single case, you know, I know Lily's case as well. You know, Lily's daughter, who is an extraordinary person and a really quite, I think, important psychotherapist, interestingly. I think it's true to say that there is a connective tissue between all the second generation, by and large, where they knew that their fathers or mothers or both parents were survivors. But as I say, never the full horrors of it. That emerged differently. That emerged rather in a variety of different ways, sometimes in behaviors, sometimes in the kind of complex psychodynamics of a home where somebody might be explosive or exhibit behaviors where everybody would immediately cushion with the whisper of what they've been through, right? But there was certainly never a sense in which I was unaware of my grandfather being a survivor was absolutely present as a fact of his life. That's why there are no aunts and uncles and so on and so forth. But there was it was just never discussed. How do you bring that up? What's the moment when you say we're now going to sit down and talk about the trauma of your childhood? But as he got older, he would speak to my brother and I. We were very kind of present face to face in his life. We'd go directly from school to his house after, certainly for nearly all of our schooling. So from time to time, he'd tell these stories in a much more lucid way and a much clearer and, I suppose, frank way than he could with his own daughter. But when he died, again, extraordinary things, but by his bed, a man who was living in some comfort by then, he had dotted around the hospital and around the house little serviettes or napkins, and inside was little bits of food everywhere. Now you fast forward to me standing in Poland in the cold, freezing cold, and thinking to myself, what does it mean to be hungry? And then casting my mind back to that trauma and thinking about him putting food all over the place just to make sure that you're not hungry. You stand near the survivors, and it's such a privilege and gift and so important. If you ever get the tragically dwindling chance, two things that everybody experiences, regardless of who you are, your background, is firstly, this sense of, it's true of all, of course, Jewish culture, and that you never knowingly under catered. But there's a sense that food and being around food and feeding is an act of love. And there's an added complexity, an added dynamic complexion to it when you've lived without it, when you've been starved, when you've been in indentured servitude as a slave. And I say that and think about that, reflect on that as we come up to Pesach, as we're doing this interview in a few days' time. And then also the ruach that they have, that these are people that delight in simcha and joy in a way that nobody else does. So yeah, it was never a secret. Never a secret. It just wasn't discussed. And actually, in the Holocaust, My Family and Me, that is as I say, the thread, the sort of dark thread that weaves itself into the tapestry of all of the second generation stories. That it wasn't discussed, for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah. Now, one of our previous guests on the podcast, the brilliant author Dara Horn, whose book People Love Dead Jews questions why society seems more interested in commemorating dead Jews over protecting the living ones. She says that one issue with Holocaust education is that it sets the bar for anti-Semitism too high, meaning people today may view acts of anti-Semitism and remain apathetic because she says that it's not the Holocaust. And she is speaking from an American perspective. And I'm wondering if that opinion resonates with you, and also whether you think that people are sufficiently aware of modern anti-Semitism and its manifestations.
Well, there's about 5 questions in there, and they're so nuanced. So there's it's a PhD thesis in one go. I mean, there are facets of kind of the American political situation. And I mean, David Baddiel's excellent book, which should have won the Wingate Prize. I want to emphasize that Jews Don't Count touches on this as well, albeit in a different way. I don't know whether the person you're referring to is right about that. I think there is a kernel of truth in it. One of the elements that I think is perhaps that I immediately think about it in an American context is that anti-Jewish racism is perhaps enabled or isn't considered to be as existentially threatening or as perhaps politically important in America, because there is this issue now, especially where Jewish people have been able to be to sort of be part of the white privileged majority. And so to that extent, in the current climate and the current conversation, especially in America, very especially in America, around race, the reality is that I suppose that Jewish people have played such a central role in various institutions for a long period of time, that they're perceived perhaps to have a disproportionate sense of power. And that power could only have been achieved by being white. So the fact that they're Jewish is perhaps incidental. In other words, in the American political context around being part of an oppressed minority, for want of a better way of putting it, they no longer count because they can pass as white, and so consequently have been able to assimilate entirely into American life and consequently pass, and therefore are no longer victims of prejudice. They are able to be the beneficiaries, if you like, of what is now part of the general discussion of white privilege. So that's again a whole different discussion, and I think it's very complex to reflect on. And so when she says, the bar is the Shoah, and people are not, therefore they ignore anti-Semitism that takes place in a greater, in the phenomenon of anti-Jewish racism still exists. Basically, unless it's Nazism, it's not real. Again, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, there is evidence that there could be people who could defend the head of the Labour Party, who not only defended but liked a trope which was a sort of fundamental ingredient for enduring anti-Semitism, the elders of the protocols are. And for those who don't know what we're talking about, Jeremy Corbyn liked a mural, and this wasn't an incidental like, it was very purposive. And by the way, I think he would find the idea that he was anti-Semitic deeply odious, and I think we should give him credit for that, because it is true to say that he has stood against anti-fascism all his life, but that anti-Semitism now has moved into different spaces and, as it always does, morphed into different movements. And so, I think that there is something to be said for that. The idea that perhaps if it's not the show, it's not anti-Semitism. As I say, it is true that anti-Jewish racism struggles to be taken as seriously as other forms of racism. And that's especially true now. What I mean by that is that there are insidious ways in which anti-Semitism forms a loosely acceptable part of the social conversation, which is unchecked in a way that would never be the case when it comes to other issues of race. It's just it's true. And there are lots of examples of that being the case. Be it the kind of unchecked presence of conspiracy theories online, or the kind of casual way that nowadays people like Soros and so on and so forth are placed at the epicenter of this sort of shadowy running of events. But I don't know that she's right to say that if it falls short of the Shoah, that people don't take it seriously. I think it's harder because it's sort of less obvious. And there are, of course, straightforward cases of people being trolled online in an anti-Semitic way. We know it when we see it, right? Or there are evident cases, and there have been evident cases, of people being racially abused on buses, or the Haredi community being harassed and the subject of physical violence in Stamford Hill, for instance. I think by and large, people seeing and experiencing that feel in the media, feel that that's unacceptable. They are aggrieved by it just as they are aggrieved by any form of racially motivated violence. I do think that. That's, by the way, borne out by the numbers and by the research that we know of, I think. But in general terms, I also think that there is a sense that, and I've even had this said to me, that Jews somehow are no longer part of an existentially threatened minority, that they are disproportionately powerful, so consequently cannot be oppressed. They no longer experience racism in a way that really needs tackling or really needs a kind of enduring degree of vigilance, because, like I say, they have a state or disproportionate power, or because they are by and large white, leaving aside the Sephardi reality and so on and so forth. And so because of that, there's a sense in which anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish racism isn't perhaps considered to be as serious a problem or taken as seriously as it should be. So it's a very long-winded answer, because I really want to sort of reflect on that. You know, the sort of idea that as we speak, I find the sort of idea problematic. This idea that somehow speaking about the Shoah, I'm sure this is not what your academic was getting at, is a problem because somehow what we're doing is saying, well, look, this is the paradigm of where hate leads, and this is the last moment that Jews experienced existential racism, and therefore more talking about it more is a problem in some way. I wonder whether that's what she's getting at, and if so, I think that's completely wrong.
I think she was more getting at the fact that she's in America, she's experiencing, well, she's seeing a lot of these mass shootings and hostage attacks, and based on this, you know, people will feel bad, but then they'll go to a Holocaust exhibition, and they'll think, well, at least it's not that. And I think that was what she was angry about.
I don't know. I mean, that strikes me as a slightly simplistic view of things. Any more that somebody will go to a exhibit about slavery and think that racism is resolved. You know, it depends on how we locate the Shoah, and you know, there are some really good examples of exhibits. My program, for instance, the one that I made, has none of the graphic imagery that you tend to see or experience in Holocaust documentaries. What it chiefly is about, and I come back to it, is about Western liberal democracy, about the sort of idea, not the idea, the fundamental truism that what you need for Western liberal democracy to descend into depravity is the right conditions. A treaty to be, or for people to feel aggrieved by a treaty. We see the echo of that now. Serious kind of economic privation or catastrophe. Again, we're at that moment, and the right person to be in the wrong place at the right time. And there you have your alchemy. And it doesn't take much for that slow descent. And you know, we're seeing shadows of this. So I don't think that that's right. I don't think they go, well, it's not the Shoah. And if that is right, then the problem is in how we communicate, how we share the enduring lessons of the Holocaust. And I might emphasize, and I always add this, you know, this really matters to me, that the Jewish experience of Jewish racism didn't begin and end in the Holocaust. I talk about this a lot, you know, and again, it's really interesting as we come to this interview. I'm sure we'll go out later, but we're coming to Pesach, right? You know, we're Jews because we came out of the land of Egypt. It is a well-known kind of funny remark, I suppose. The way in which a phrase that we contain what all of Jewish history is, which is they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. But, we're Jews because we came out of the land of Egypt together. Now, it doesn't matter how true that is, but in the programs that I make, the reality of the Jewish lived experience and its perpetual sense of existential threat, be it in various parts of Europe or the Middle East, has been true and goes on being true today. That we are effectively guests within a land. And so if there is a problem that people think, well, it's not the Holocaust, to some extent that might be a problem with the exhibits or how we're teaching Holocaust education, perhaps. I don't know. But I just don't think that's right. I just don't think perhaps we are as good. There's two things. Perhaps we're not as good at talking about the insidious ways that anti-Semitism has morphed. And also because now a good deal of anti-Jewish racism has been adopted by what you might describe as the acceptable political mainstream. And because a lot of it is inextricably bound up with the state of Israel. And so to that extent, I think that's a bigger problem than the idea that somehow people feel, well, it's not the Shoah. As I say, and I come back to this sort of idea, again, it's very long-winded because I hadn't really thought about it in a way presented by that thesis. I think, as I say, the British people who I know and can speak of and about, when they see anti-Semitism that looks like straightforward anti-Semitism, and what I mean by straightforward anti-Semitism, the trolling of somebody online, be it of somebody like Rachel Riley or Lee Kern, who CA really sort of were activists for, or the stuff that they can see, that they are horrified by it. I just don't think they're necessarily as obviously educated in the various insidious ways, as I say, that anti-Jewish racism now exists. But last thing, sorry, because I will say this, it speaks real volumes that in the last general election, what we know, again, from decent research and the stuff on the doorstep, as you speak to Labour Party candidates, is that people across our country, especially in what were real tribal Labour heartlands, didn't just disavow, but at the top of the things that they were talking about in response to Jeremy Corbyn was his anti-Jewish racism, or was the platform that the party had adopted in respect of anti-Jewish racism. And to that extent, I thought that was a really good news story. So I don't think that's right. I don't think people need to think that it's not the Holocaust. I think there is a general sense of fairness and a general intuitive understanding. That's been a response, for example, to my documentary as well, that people fundamentally support the Jewish communities. Although it has to be said, they often don't really know how many Jews there are in the UK and rather overstate it. I mean, people are often, in fact, almost entirely always surprised when they discover there's less than 300,000 of us in the UK. Sorry, it's a very long-winded answer. I think it's a difficult question. I think the sort of idea that, as you say, well, they go, well, they're just fine. They're not under threat because it's not the Shoah. Well, then we're doing some really bad Holocaust education if that's what people think. And I don't think they do. I just think perhaps they think Jews are no longer oppressed in the way that other minorities have lived experiences which were more immediate and obvious.
Hello, thank you very much for watching. If you're enjoying this interview, please like the video below and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode of Podcast Against Antisemitism. Now, back to the podcast. Well, you spoke of modern anti-Semitism just now, and recent statistics have shown that anti-Semitism in Britain has risen to record levels, and this is something you've spoken about quite a bit, including at a Together Against Anti-Semitism rally in December 2019. And in a piece published earlier this year, you wrote, "This is the tragic reality of being Jewish in London in 2022, not in some far off time or place, but right now and right here in the greatest, most cosmopolitan city in the world." What prompted you to write that piece, and what do you think needs to be done?
Um, yeah, it's really true. I mean, let me just give 2 examples. A really famous person came to a Holocaust Education Trust dinner, and they were coming from, I have to be careful here. They were coming from a pretty important media institution. And they were speaking to colleagues, and they said to this person, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, I'm speaking at the HET, the Holocaust Education Trust." And his colleague said, "Controversial." Let's stop and pause and reflect on that for a second. That was only a few years ago. Why would they think that could be conceivably controversial? Um, I know people that, I don't feel this and never have, and I must emphasize it, but I know people who live in certain communities that feel that they don't want to, that was that prompted the piece, that didn't want to put a menorah in their window outside of, you know, Jewish communities where there's a wealth of other Jews, because they felt that that was inviting attack. The reality is, and again, from the article that I wrote, is there something peculiarly disturbing about going to a Jewish school, a state-funded Jewish school, and having worked for as long as I have over the years in prisons, and feeling to get in, because that's a reality. It is easier to get into I'm trying to think of the correct terminology, but a medium security prison would be right. That is the same in terms of the protection and all of the security that's in place to protect Jewish kids that go to school every day simply to learn. Now, that doesn't exist because we are, as a people, um, especially paranoid. That exists on a rational assessment of the enduring day-to-day threats that our children face by going to school. This idea that putting a menorah in your window in UK in 2019 and in 2020, that sending your kids to Jewish school, that expressing your Judaism in the street by wearing Jewish clothing, represents a risk. Even the fact that it represents a risk to your body, to your life, is the most clear and articulate expression imaginable of the enduring dark presence of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish racism. And yes, there is security at other primary schools, but it doesn't come close to this. What do we do about it? The answer is activism. And there's really good activism everywhere. And above all else, including as many people in that activism, making it part of their buffet, if you like, of things that they care about. That they cannot be anti-racist. It's impossible to be anti-racist. It's impossible to be an activist and consequently on the right side of history unless you include anti-Jewish racism also at the center of your activism. Knowing the existential risk every day, even now, of Jews who are just living their lives in various parts of the country, going to a synagogue to pray, wherever they are, the levels of security, and so on and so forth. And the examples of Jewish people online, very often people feel, because it's abstract, this sort of idea that political ideas no longer sit in the logical cortex of people's brains. They sit where the identity is. So challenge somebody on an idea, they're not really listening. The way to engage is to try and trigger the emotional hemisphere of the brain. So at least somebody's going to hear you in a more powerful way, which means quality examples. And exactly as you're describing, there are limitless situations of people being trolled online in an anti-Semitic way. The lived experiences of the Jewish societies, who are chiefly at universities, who are chiefly not doing work about the state of Israel, which undoubtedly has a whole range of different people representing different views about the very complex political situation in Israel, but whose societies are being attempted to be shut down, closed. The Jewish societies, uniquely, and people threatened, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are so many examples of the day-to-day lived experiences of Jewish people who are threatened, othered, and who every day risk their children's lives to send them to school. That you don't really need more, I think, to kind of explain the enduring presence, as I say, of anti-Jewish racism. But as I say, the most important thing is that we have activism in three different ways. Firstly, the type of important thing that the campaign against anti-Semitism is doing, which is to say there's nowhere for these people to hide legally. We will come after you. You know, there are some that being legally aggressive really does matter. It's enormously important. Leaving aside the sort of strategic reasons why that's important, in terms of activism, the fact that somebody who is espousing anti-Jewish hate and anti-Jewish racism, which they would never be allowed to do if they were attacking any other minority group, I hope, although some of them go on doing that. It's a special problem with the trans communities, for instance. But we'll leave that aside. That the fact that they're enabled, that they are held legally to account is enormously important because, as I say, we are a nation of laws in this country, and there are really good quality laws that can be used to stop these people. The difficulty is people don't necessarily use them. So that CAA is doing that is of limitless importance. Secondly, really trying to engage in a thoughtful way rather than in a reactionary way to how people slip into anti-Semitism. So when, for example, it is okay to criticize the Israeli government. It is more than okay. I do it a lot, all the time, in fact. But it's not so much that, it's when you start seeing online the various ways in which Israel now especially has formed the epicenter of dark global conspiracy theories, which have at their core anti-Semitic tropes, protocols of the Elders of Zion, all that stuff that certainly were part of the dark ingredients that led into the Shoah, but existed before that in the form of pogroms and the whole history of prejudice and seclusion and ultimate various destructions of the Jewish people over the years. So we need a better online presence, a better way of dealing with that online. Be that calling the publishers, although they say that's not what they are, be that calling the social media companies to account and reporting people and so on and so forth, but also being better positive advocates online. So really addressing people insofar as we can as, and having good examples, because often they don't realize that they've slipped into anti-Jewish racism because it's become part of the sort of accepted conversation. And that's important. We need to be effective in communicating. Look, this is what you're doing. And thirdly, education. And by education, things like not just my documentary, but in general, not just Holocaust education, but as part of our national curriculum and as part of the social conversation, when we're talking about anti-racism, we must work alongside other minority groups in partnership to find ways of sharing platforms to ensure that our messages don't get diluted. That the idea that when they attack one minority, we share that history of oppression, albeit in different ways. Basically, it seems to me that we need to find better ways of saying to people, you cannot be an activist, an anti-racist activist, if you hold these views. To call them legally to account and to become more effective, both on the online and social space, at communicating what anti-Semitism is and making every single person personally responsible for being positively anti-racist in a way that at its core and epicenter includes anti-Jewish racism.
Absolutely. You've previously revealed that as a barrister, you have defended members of the National Front, which maybe is a shock to some people, given
Yeah,
that you are Jewish and also gay.
sure.
And I'm wondering how you feel able to defend people who you know may hate you and may hate what you stand for, and how you approach a case like that.
Limitlessly proud because it's not about them. This is about being, and this is how and why, CAA has been so effective, because we are a nation of laws. There is no democracy unless there is the rule of law. And my job was to stand between the individual and the state. And if anything, the legacy of the Shoah and my grandfather's enduring memory, his presence taught me, was that was the motivation. Him standing there listening to anti-Semitic bile and saying, back in the days when you saw somebody's eyes as they were doing it in Speaker's Corner, you see, Hess, in this country, this man can say what he wants. Without that, we don't want to shut it down. We want it in the public square, albeit within limitation. You can't incite racial hatred, that's for sure. But there is no democracy unless somebody is there defending people, even people we disagree with. They are entitled to a fair trial, because if the people that you're referring to who I represented were not and are not, then what does that mean? I'm not either. It's not just a slippery slope argument. We live no longer in democracy unless everybody, even the worst amongst us, are entitled to a fair trial. And one of the principles of being a barrister is something called the Cabaret Rule, where you are bound to defend somebody even where you disagree with their points of view. One of the things that was very useful in that experience when I came in the public eye, I have to tell you, I don't read other people's tweets, I should say, is that, when I looked at and experienced and was amongst the lives of people espousing hate, people that have perhaps residual energy in their lives to write something unpleasant on Twitter, I don't know, and I suspect your listeners, and you don't know anybody who does that, really. I just don't know anybody that engages in that sort of de facto violence, right? Let's call it that, right? Hate. I never met anybody from those communities of hate that lived a happy life, who lived amongst a community whose life you would envy. This was deeply devoid of joy, of simcha, of delight. It really was that when you come into these communities of hate, when you're amongst it, what you're absolutely cognizant of is how deeply miserable it is. And my instant reaction, and as a human being, was to hear and to understand and to feel deeply sorry for somebody who's invested so much of their energies, their lives in hate. And I should tell you, in the cases I did, very few of them, at the heart of what was happening, by the way, wasn't me defending their political points of view. It was because, for instance, they were being accused of, let's say, various public order offences. And in this instance, it may have been that the defence were that the police had acted in a way which was unlawful. And in some cases, the police had acted unlawfully, often in a way that I would rather applaud. I was quite glad, as a citizen, that they had acted unlawfully and perhaps shut down various protests or so on and so forth. And, that would have been the result I would have wanted as a citizen, as an activist, as a Jew who cares deeply about the stuff. But that's not what was at stake. The rule of law was at stake. And unless I defended those people, what does it mean for us? The first thing that disappeared, and this is so important, and as you can see me becoming increasingly passionate about, it's why the conversation needs to exist. And we talk about the Shoah, we think about Ukraine now to some extent, is about the rule of law. When we think about, and this is why CAA is so important, this is not an explosion of violence. I repeat that, it's not a St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of Catholics against their Protestant neighbours in early modern or late modern Europe, right? Early modern. These were a series of laws that broke down. This was the usurpation of a democratic state through gradual erosion of laws, which people tolerated, was eventually shanghaied. And slowly, because there was no lawyers or enough people to stand up to defend those laws, to demand that the laws were protected and safeguarded, that the rule of law maintained, eventually led to the Holocaust. And it's true in other parts of the world as well. And so it is essential